Millionaire humiliates and fires the poor elderly janitor, without even suspecting who he was. But without suspecting what awaited him next. In the heart of the bustling city, stood the gleaming tower of Whitmore Enterprises, a skyscraper clad in glass and steel, towering over the crowded streets like a beacon of affluence. The tower's walls were lined with mirrored windows that reflected the sun's golden rays during the day and the city's vibrant lights at night. Inside, the offices were a paradise of luxury. Polished marble floors, chandeliers hanging from high ceilings, and a constant aroma of fresh coffee and leather from finely upholstered couches. At the very top floor, occupying an office more spacious than many city apartments, was the formidable Charles Whitmore, the company's CEO and a self-made millionaire. His office overlooked the sprawling metropolis, a view he adored, as it symbolized everything he'd built from nothing. Success to Charles was everything. For him, it was the natural order that people like him belonged at the top while the rest merely served, only as valuable as their usefulness to his empire. Charles Whitmore was proud, perhaps too proud, of his achievements, and his lavish surroundings reflected that pride in every way. Charles ruled his company with an iron fist, known for his ruthlessness and lack of patience, especially with those he considered beneath him. His employees knew better than to cross him or waste his time, for he despised inefficiency almost as much as he despised weakness. He strode through the halls like a monarch surveying his kingdom, unaware or indifferent to the hushed conversations or the cautious glances cast in his direction. Within this luxurious haven, however, there was one soul who went largely unnoticed, quietly maintaining the pristine space with diligence and humility. An elderly janitor, whose soft footsteps and gentle hands had kept these halls shining and spotless, was nearly invisible to those who worked there. Day in and day out, he mopped floors, dusted shelves, and emptied trash bins without complaint. Wrinkles etched deeply into his face and his hair a silvery gray, the janitor wore an expression of calm that seemed to suggest a depth few understood. Despite his age, he moved with a practiced grace, always keeping his head down, tending to his work as if it were the most important thing in the world. And so, in this palace of wealth, two figures moved, one in the spotlight, the other in the shadows. They would soon cross paths, and their encounter would shake the very foundation of Whitmore Enterprises. Charles Whitmore was a man with an edge as sharp as the tailored suits he wore. Every morning, he arrived in his chauffeured luxury car, impeccably dressed in the latest fashion, a navy blue suit with subtle pinstripes, custom Italian leather shoes, and a watch that alone cost more than the average person's yearly salary. He kept his hair slicked back, every strand precisely in place, as if his entire appearance was carefully crafted to command respect and instill fear. His cold, piercing gaze scanned each employee he passed, eyes narrowed with a mix of disinterest and suspicion. Charles didn't believe in second chances, and he certainly didn't believe in kindness as a means to success. To him, weakness was a disease, something he had fought against in his own life with a relentless drive that left little room for empathy. He was a man who believed in hierarchies. People had their places, and those places were largely dictated by what they could offer him. He thrived on his power, often reminding others that everything in the building, every desk, every piece of furniture, and every person was there because of his genius. The employees, in turn, feared him. Even the executives treaded carefully around him, aware that any slip-up could result in a harsh reprimand, if not outright termination. At the opposite end of this hierarchy stood the elderly janitor, known simply as Old Job to most. Joe moved quietly through the building, pushing his janitorial cart loaded with cleaning supplies, brooms and rags, all worn but carefully maintained. He was tall, with a slight stoop in his back, and his face, lined with years of hard work, held a look of quiet endurance. His hands were calloused, the hands of someone who had seen decades of labor. Most saw him as just another piece of the background, an unremarkable part of the building's operation, easily forgotten. Despite his outward humility, there was something about Joe that set him apart. Occasionally, an employee would catch a glint of something sharp and knowing in his gaze, a fleeting moment of intelligence that didn't quite align with his role as the building's janitor. But these moments passed quickly, and no one thought much of them. Old Joe did his work without complaint, seemingly content with his duties, and carried an air of mystery that remained largely ignored by those around him. The days in Whitmore Enterprises followed a familiar pattern. The elite in their glass-walled offices, discussing deals and deadlines, while people like old Joe cleaned up the mess they left behind. Charles Whitmore barely noticed Joe, seeing him only as a necessary but insignificant part of the building's operations. In his eyes, the elderly janitor was part of the scenery, someone who didn't warrant a second glance. Charles had no time for people like that. In his world, success was for the strong, the ambitious, the powerful. And power, as far as Charles was concerned, was wealth. He had no patience for those without it, and often muttered disdainfully about people who didn't make something of themselves. To him, Joe's presence was almost an offense, a reminder of what he'd fought to rise above. On the rare occasions when Charles did happen to notice him, he would sneer or offer a look of disdain, his expression laced with a sort of incredulous disgust that someone could be so content with so little. Joe, for his part, never reacted. He moved through the hallways with a quiet dignity, neither bitter nor particularly deferential. Each evening, he would pass through Charles's office to empty the trash and give the floor a quick mop, nodding politely to Charles if he was still there, working late over his files. Charles rarely acknowledged him, and if he did, it was with a brisk "you missed a spot," or "be quick about it." Joe would nod respectfully, never challenging or even responding, simply going about his work as if those remarks rolled right off his back. To Charles, Joe was invisible. The old man's silence, his humility, all seemed to affirm Charles's assumptions about him. He was, after all, just a janitor, a man who had clearly failed to make anything of himself. And so, Charles felt no obligation to treat Joe with even the most basic respect. If anything, he saw Joe's presence as evidence of a well-ordered hierarchy, where he stood as the towering figure of success, and people like Joe remained in the shadows, there to serve him. But within this hierarchy, something simmered. Beneath the millionaire's obliviousness and the janitor's quiet presence, there lay a tension like the stillness before a storm. Neither man knew yet, but this carefully constructed power dynamic would soon be turned on its head in a way Charles Whitmore could never have imagined. One damp morning, as the city was still wrapped in the quietness of dawn, old Joe shuffled through the lobby of Whitmore Enterprises, beginning his usual routine. He was scrubbing a particularly stubborn stain on the floor near the executive elevators when Charles arrived, earlier than usual and already on edge. He had been dealing with a complicated deal overseas that had kept him awake most of the night, and the frustration showed in the tense lines on his face and the tightness of his jaw. As he approached the elevators, Charles spotted Joe, hunched over the floor with a mop and a worn sponge, moving slowly as he tried to erase the dark mark left by some unknown culprit the night before. Joe's pace, normally deliberate, appeared to Charles as unbearably slow, and the sight triggered something in him, a flash of annoyance that he couldn't shake. Charles walked up, tapping his shoe impatiently on the polished floor just behind Joe. With a scoff, he cleared his throat. "You realize this is a business, not a nursing home," he said sharply, his voice dripping with condescension. Joe looked up, his expression calm but with a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. "Yes, sir," he replied softly. He didn't offer any excuses, simply nodded and kept scrubbing the floor. The lack of reaction, the simple humility, only irritated Charles further. "Is it too much to expect someone to keep the place looking decent?" he muttered, loud enough for his words to echo in the empty lobby. He shook his head and added, honestly, "I don't even understand why you're still here if you can't keep up." Joe remained silent, bowing his head slightly as he continued his work. He gave no reaction, no pushback, which only seemed to inflame Charles's growing irritation. With an impatient sigh, Charles jabbed the elevator button, muttering under his breath about incompetent help and wasted money. As he stepped into the elevator, Charles shot one last dismissive look at the elderly janitor, feeling a surge of superiority as he left Joe to finish cleaning up the remnants of his high-end establishment. It was, he thought, exactly how things should be. The powerful moving up, and the powerless remaining below. Little did he know that this encounter would mark the beginning of a series of events that would unravel the very life he believed he controlled so completely. The following day, the tension escalated. It was a busy afternoon at Whitmore Enterprises, with several high-profile clients visiting for a meeting that Charles had been preparing for meticulously. The lobby was bustling, as executives hurried about and staff members ensured everything was in pristine condition to impress the clients. Amid the rush, old Joe was cleaning the glass doors at the entrance, moving a little slower than usual, his hands showing the tremor of age as he polished each pane. Just as the clients arrived, Charles caught sight of Joe. His thin frame hunched over the door handle, concentrating on a particularly greasy fingerprint. Charles's brow furrowed, his irritation from the previous morning resurfacing with force. With the eyes of his important clients on him, Charles felt the need to assert his authority, to make it clear that his standards were uncompromising, even with something as minor as a fingerprint. "Joe," he barked, his voice echoing across the lobby. Heads turned as everyone fell silent, taken aback by the sharpness in Charles's tone. Joe looked up slowly, blinking in the bright lobby lights, and set his rag down gently. "Are you blind?" Charles continued, his voice loud and cold as he walked over to Joe. "Look at this smudge. This building is a reflection of my brand, my standards. And here you are, leaving fingerprints all over it." He gestured at the glass door in exaggerated frustration, shaking his head as if the stain were a personal offense. Joe took a step back, his expression unchanging, but the quiet in his eyes seemed to deepen. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but stopped, simply nodding as he reached for his cleaning rag again. Charles, however, wasn't done. "Do you even care about your job?" he snapped, his voice carrying across the lobby. "I'm beginning to wonder if you even belong here. At your age, shouldn't you have found anything better to do than to stumble around making things worse?" The clients exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly surprised by the intensity of Charles's reprimand. But Charles, too consumed by his own anger, paid them no mind. His only thought was to establish beyond any doubt that no one, not even a lowly janitor, could slack off on his watch. Satisfied, Charles turned back to his clients, a thin, triumphant smile on his face, oblivious to the damage he had just done to something far more fragile than a polished glass door. The tension in the lobby hung thick in the air, the quiet murmurs of onlookers underscoring the discomfort Charles's outburst had caused. Old Joe continued polishing the glass door, his movements slow and methodical, his gaze lowered. His hands shook slightly, but his face remained composed, bearing the practiced stoic expression of someone who had weathered a lifetime of harsh words and cold dismissals. For a moment, Joe's calm demeanor seemed to quell the tension, as if the room itself were taking a breath. But Charles wasn't satisfied with just a public reprimand. The pent-up irritation, the restless need to assert his authority, seemed to drive him toward a final, decisive action. He looked at Joe, his expression a blend of disdain and impatience. "Actually," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "you know what? I don't think this is working out." Joe paused, his rag falling still against the glass as he looked up, meeting Charles's gaze directly for the first time. There was something there, something unspoken in Joe's eyes, a flicker of recognition, of defiance, but it was gone in an instant. Charles continued, ignoring the gathering eyes on them. "Pack up your things," he said with an air of finality. "You're fired. Effective immediately." A murmur spread through the lobby as Joe stood there, holding his cleaning rag in one hand, his shoulders squared, his posture dignified even in the face of Charles's dismissal. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his response. He looked around, his gaze moving slowly over the faces of the other employees, many of whom looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. But Joe said nothing. He gave a single nod, his expression unreadable, and turned to leave. His steps were slow and deliberate as he walked past Charles, the sounds of his shoes echoing through the now silent lobby. Charles felt a sense of satisfaction, a self-righteous assurance that he'd handled a problem with the efficiency he prided himself on. But as Joe walked away, a strange feeling washed over him, something he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the calmness in Joe's departure, the unsettling dignity in the way he accepted his fate without a word of protest. Whatever it was, Charles shook it off, already looking forward, already back to business. But even as he resumed his meeting, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind, one he couldn't quite shake. He had fired old Joe, but something told him he hadn't seen the last of him. Over the next few days, life at Whitmore Enterprises seemed to return to normal. Employees moved on with their routines, and even Charles's dramatic firing of old Joe quickly became just another office anecdote, a fleeting, uncomfortable moment that faded into the background. Charles resumed his usual schedule, feeling justified and even slightly smug about his decision, convinced he had only strengthened his reputation as a leader who tolerated nothing less than perfection. But then, something strange began to happen. On the third day after Joe's dismissal, Charles noticed a figure sitting at the edge of the street, facing cafe across from the office building. At first, he thought it was just another passerby, one of many who frequented the cafe for a quick coffee or a moment's rest. But as he left the building that evening, he caught sight of the man's face beneath an old worn cap. It was Joe. The next morning, Charles found Joe there again, seated quietly, sipping from a paper cup. His gaze turned thoughtfully toward the Whitmore Enterprises building. Each day, Joe appeared at the same spot in the cafe, at the same time. His expression calm but focused. The subtle regularity of it, the persistence of Joe's presence, made Charles feel a strange mixture of irritation and unease. At first he tried to brush it off. Joe was just an old man with too much time on his hands, probably clinging to some misplaced attachment to his old job. Charles told himself it was nothing to worry about. But as the days wore on, he noticed that Joe's presence was beginning to affect others as well. Employees in the building had started whispering, casting occasional glances through the lobby windows toward the cafe, where Joe sat each day like an unspoken reminder of something they couldn't quite place. Finally, Charles's curiosity, and the faint prickling of discomfort that Joe's presence evoked, got the better of him. He instructed a junior employee to approach Joe casually and find out what he was doing. But when the employee returned, they only shook their head, looking baffled. "He just said he was enjoying his coffee," the employee reported. "Didn't say much else." Now, what had once been an act of dismissal began to take on a life of its own. Charles couldn't explain why, but he felt as though something was slipping out of his control. As the days stretched into a week, Joe's presence became a fixture, a silent shadow looming over Charles's mind. It was no longer just an odd sighting. Now, every time Charles glanced out the window, he found himself catching glimpses of Joe. His calm figure a constant reminder that refused to be ignored. One morning, as Charles stepped into the elevator, he overheard two employees whispering. "Did you know he was in the business world years back?" One said in hushed excitement. "Apparently, he's been in and out of places like this for decades." Charles's interest peaked, and though he would never admit it, he strained to catch more of the conversation as they continued. "I heard he was a partner in some big deal back in the day, but he vanished from the business scene," the other employee added. "No one really knows why." Charles frowned. Partner. Big deal. It couldn't be true. Joe was just a janitor, an elderly man who probably spent his life working menial jobs. The thought that Joe might have been anything other than ordinary grated against the image Charles had formed of him. Over the next few days, small clues began to surface, as if the universe itself was conspiring to reveal secrets that had been hidden in plain sight. A document left in his office from a decades-old acquisition had the name Joseph Harland signed at the bottom, the same name Charles had glimpsed on Joe's ID badge. The name lingered in his mind, and against his better judgment, he ran a quick search on his office computer. What he found left him staring at the screen in disbelief. There were old articles, some archived business reviews, each one linking the name Joseph Harland to a powerful and influential figure in the finance world during the 1980s and 1990s. Joseph Harland had been a partner in several major investment firms, a respected name known for his unerring business sense, his humble demeanor, and a reputation for treating people fairly in an industry known for its ruthlessness. Charles's chest tightened as he read on. Joe wasn't just a failed janitor as he'd thought. He was a retired, successful investor, a man whose wealth and influence might have once matched, or even exceeded, Charles's own. A chill settled over him, as he realized just how wrong he had been. Charles's world tilted as the pieces began to fall into place. Joseph Harland. The name that he had dismissed as a nobody now echoed in his mind, its significance growing with each article, each hint of a prestigious past. Old Joe had been more than a businessman. He had once been a respected figure in circles that Charles himself aspired to dominate. The unsettling truth gnawed at him, and he found himself distracted, his confidence beginning to waver. Charles's mind kept replaying scenes of Joe's quiet departure, his dignified silence during the public humiliation, and most disturbingly, his steady, knowing gaze. It was as if Joe had been waiting for Charles to realize this truth. One evening, restless and unable to shake his curiosity, Charles called in his assistant and requested an archive search of Whitmore Enterprises' financial records from before his own time. Sure enough, there it was. A series of small, almost unnoticeable investments, each tied back to a J. Harland. Each investment was modest yet consistent, as if a quiet observer had been monitoring and nurturing the growth of the company for years. The most surprising discovery came with a document buried deep in the archives, signed nearly 2 decades ago, indicating that a controlling percentage of shares in Whitmore Enterprises had been initially ceded by Joseph Harland. In other words, Joe hadn't just worked for Whitmore Enterprises. He was one of its earliest backers. Charles sank back in his chair, stunned. If Joe still held shares, it would mean that the elderly janitor had a considerable degree of influence over the company's affairs, perhaps even the authority to make significant decisions. The weight of this revelation crashed down on Charles, filling him with an unsettling mix of awe and dread. The notion that he had not only fired but humiliated a man who had effectively built the foundations of his company left Charles rattled. Questions spiraled in his mind. Why had Joe returned under the guise of a janitor? Why had he concealed his identity? And perhaps most pressing of all, what was Joe's purpose now? As Charles stared into the evening shadows creeping across his office, he felt, for the first time in his life, a nagging fear that his future might not be entirely within his control. The next morning, Charles couldn't wait any longer. The knowledge that Joe was no ordinary man, but a hidden force within his company, left him with a burning need for answers. When he arrived at the office, he glanced out the window and saw Joe, as usual, sitting quietly at his spot in the cafe, his figure calm and composed. Charles stormed out of the building, crossed the street, and approached Joe. As he neared, Joe looked up, his gaze steady, the same quiet wisdom lingering in his eyes as it had during their first encounter. For the first time, Charles felt a sense of hesitation, a nagging unease that his status and authority might not carry the weight they usually did. "Joe," Charles began, his tone harsher than he intended, or should I say, Joseph Harland. The name felt foreign in his mouth, a reminder of how little he truly knew about the man. Joe didn't flinch. He simply nodded, folding his hands in front of him. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." His tone was calm, but there was a hint of amusement in his eyes, as if he'd been expecting this moment. Charles hesitated, suddenly feeling vulnerable under Joe's gaze. "Why are you here?" he demanded. "Why pretend to be a janitor in my company, in my building? You're not what you seem, are you?" Joe's lips curved into a slight smile, a kind expression that held no malice. "Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Whitmore," he replied. "Sometimes the best way to understand a place, and the people in it, is to observe from a humble position, to see what lies beneath the polished surface." Charles clenched his fists, resisting the urge to sit down, to let his guard down in front of this man who had quietly unsettled everything he thought he knew. "Why didn't you tell me? You've been watching me." Joe gave a soft nod. "Yes, You see, I wanted to see what kind of man was now at the helm of this company I once invested so much in. Sometimes wealth and power change people. He paused, studying Charles's face, his gaze piercing yet compassionate. I needed to see what kind of person you truly were. In that moment, Charles understood. This was more than a job, it had been a test. Joe's words hung in the air, their weight settling heavily on Charles. He felt exposed, as if Joe had peeled away his carefully constructed image layer by layer, seeing a side of him that no one else dared confront. Charles steadied himself, his voice faltering slightly as he asked, "So, this whole time you've been assessing me? Judging me?" He tried to keep his tone accusatory, but the crack in his voice betrayed a sliver of doubt. Joe took a measured breath, his eyes holding a wisdom that seemed to come from a lifetime of observation. "Not judging, Mr. Whitmore," he said softly. "Observing. When I first invested in this company, it wasn't just about money. I believed in the principles Whitmore Enterprises once stood for: integrity, respect, hard work. But over the years, I've seen how easily those principles can be forgotten in the pursuit of profit." Charles shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing as Joe continued. "When I decided to return, I wanted to see if this place had kept those values alive. I wanted to see if you, Charles Whitmore, embodied the same dedication I once had. But what I found," Joe paused, his gaze fixed and unyielding. "What I found was disappointing." The words hit Charles harder than he'd anticipated. He had spent years priding himself on his achievements, convinced his relentless pursuit of success was justified, even admirable. But here was Joe, a man who had walked away from wealth and power, a man who had been the foundation of the company itself, telling him that he had failed. "So what now?" Charles asked, his voice barely a whisper. He fought to mask the desperation creeping into his tone. "Are you here to take back what's yours?" Joe shook his head, his expression softening. "It's not about taking, Mr. Whitmore. It's about giving. Giving you the chance to choose what kind of leader you want to be. I have the power to make changes here, yes. I could pull my shares, dismantle my investments, maybe even see this building sold brick by brick." Charles's breath hitched at the thought, a fresh wave of panic flooding through him. "But," Joe continued, "what happens next is up to you. I didn't come here to punish you, Charles. I came here to see if there's still a heart beneath that suit. To see if there's any of the man I once dreamed of leaving this company to." Charles stood there, feeling the full weight of Joe's words, every syllable striking with more force than he cared to admit. His mind reeled, struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. He was, in essence, at the mercy of the very man he'd dismissed, humiliated, and cast aside. And yet, Joe hadn't come to destroy him. He had come to reveal something Charles had never considered: the measure of his own humanity. Joe's calm voice broke the silence. "Charles, people look to you as their leader, not just because of your title or wealth, but because they want to believe in something bigger than themselves. Your actions set the tone for this entire company." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "And yet, you've forgotten that leadership is not just about power, but about dignity, respect, and humility." A lump rose in Charles's throat, but he swallowed it down, his pride making him resist the growing feeling of shame. "So what do you expect me to do?" he asked, his voice tight, defensive. Joe tilted his head, a hint of sadness in his expression. "That's for you to decide. You have the chance to become the leader this company truly needs, or to continue down a path that leads only to ruin. Right now, you're teetering between those two paths." Charles took a shaky breath. The truth was, he had never seen himself as anything other than the all-powerful head of Whitmore Enterprises. He believed that people followed him because of his strength, his discipline, his iron will. But now he wondered if, perhaps, he had misunderstood what it meant to lead. Joe continued, his tone steady but firm. "I could revoke my support, yes, and watch everything you've built crumble. But I'd rather see this company, and you, flourish. That's why I came back. Not to tear it all down, but to give you a chance to become something greater than just another businessman." A heavy silence settled between them. Charles's defenses began to crack under the enormity of Joe's challenge. In Joe's gaze, he no longer saw the frail figure of a janitor but the wisdom and authority of a man who had walked this path before him, a man who held the power to not only build but to inspire. This was his judgment, a challenge to rise above his own flaws or watch everything he'd built come undone. As the days passed, Joe's warning lingered in Charles's mind, a constant shadow that gnawed at his once unshakable confidence. He returned to his office with an air of unease, the authority he had once wielded over his employees now tinged with doubt. He knew that Joe could dismantle Whitmore Enterprises if he chose, stripping away the empire Charles had spent years building. And worse still, he now recognized that it wasn't merely Joe's power over the company's assets that troubled him. It was the painful realization that his leadership had been lacking, that he had been blind to the humanity around him. Within a week, Charles noticed changes rippling through the company. Joe, true to his word, had begun exercising his influence subtly yet powerfully. Long-standing deals that had been precariously balanced were suddenly scrutinized. Key partnerships were re-evaluated, and even Charles's prized investors were quietly contacted, advised to consider their options more carefully. Financial reports crossed his desk, showing minor fluctuations that hinted at Joe's quiet, systematic divestment from the very company he had once supported. Panicked, Charles called meetings with his executives, attempting to contain the situation. He reached out to business associates, hoping to reaffirm their confidence. But a lingering uncertainty had crept into Whitmore Enterprises, a pervasive sense that the company might not be as untouchable as Charles had always portrayed it. The employees felt it too. Rumors circulated that Whitmore Enterprises was being closely monitored by a major shareholder, whose influence extended beyond anyone's understanding. The looming sense of instability forced Charles into a corner, one he had never anticipated. He began realizing that without Joe's support, his empire was more fragile than he had imagined. As he sat in his office, poring over spreadsheets and staring at projected losses, the weight of his actions hit him with full force. The humiliation he had inflicted upon Joe wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of how he had led his entire life, disregarding those beneath him, refusing to see the value of dignity and respect in leadership. In those quiet moments alone, Charles finally began to grasp the gravity of Joe's lesson. The foundations of his empire were crumbling, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance to rebuild them, if he could muster the courage to change. The next few days brought Charles to a breaking point. His once loyal board members began questioning his decisions, murmuring concerns about the company's future. Even employees who had once revered him kept their distance, whispers circulating that the once mighty Whitmore Enterprises was no longer as secure as they'd believed. Charles, who had always prided himself on his ability to command respect and authority, found himself in an unfamiliar position, isolated, uncertain, and painfully aware of the damage his pride had caused. Late one night, Charles sat alone in his office, the city lights casting a dim glow over his once proud empire. His gaze drifted to the spotless floors, the pristine glass, all maintained by hands he'd dismissed as unimportant. He felt a strange pang, a mixture of regret, shame, and a deepening humility. His mind wandered to the moment in the lobby when he'd humiliated Joe, treating him as though his work and worth were insignificant. The memory haunted him now, each sharp word echoing back with a clarity that made him cringe. For the first time, he realized just how deeply disconnected he had become from the people who made his success possible. His arrogance had blinded him, making him believe that power lay in wealth and titles, when in reality, true power lay in the loyalty, respect, and dedication of those who worked alongside him. He could see now how easily he'd taken that loyalty for granted, thinking his wealth alone could buy respect. It wasn't just his company that was at risk, it was his legacy, his very identity as a leader. Charles felt a weight settle in his chest as he considered the possibility that he'd been given a rare second chance. Joe had given him a choice. He could continue down this path of self-importance, ignoring the humanity around him, or he could step into a new role, one where he valued people as much as profit. As he sat there, surrounded by the evidence of his life's work, Charles understood that he was at a crossroads. His shock had turned to a grim acceptance, and with it, the realization that he had a decision to make, not only for the company but for himself. The question now was whether he had the courage to face Joe again, this time with genuine humility, and to embrace the chance for redemption that he so desperately needed. In the days that followed, Charles found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about success, leadership, and, most importantly, himself. The reality of his situation grew clearer with each passing day. His company was fragile, his employees cautious, and his reputation now as much a liability as it was a source of pride. He realized he was no longer the unassailable force he had once believed himself to be. Instead, he was a man facing the consequences of years of arrogance and isolation. Charles's attempts to reassure his board members and investors fell flat, his usual confidence faltering in the face of their skepticism. The same people who once hung on his every word now looked at him with doubt. For the first time in his career, Charles was on unstable ground, and he couldn't help but think back to Joe's words, the gentle but firm reminder that leadership was about more than authority. It was about inspiring trust, embodying respect, and lifting those around him. One evening, as he walked through the now eerily quiet halls of Whitmore Enterprises, Charles's gaze landed on the janitor's closet, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the building. He opened the door, inhaling the faint smell of cleaning products and the stale air of the cramped space. It was a world so removed from his own luxurious office, yet it held a kind of dignity, a testament to the work that Joe had quietly done for years without complaint or recognition. Standing there, Charles realized that he had never truly seen Joe, never taken the time to understand the lives of the people who worked for him. The man who had once prided himself on his ruthless ambition now felt humbled, a man standing on the edge of an unfamiliar and vulnerable reality. If he wanted to rebuild what he had so carelessly jeopardized, he would have to do more than simply patch the cracks in his company's foundation. He would have to start from the ground up, beginning with himself. He knew what he had to do. Taking a deep breath, Charles closed the door to the janitor's closet and walked out, his steps slower but more purposeful. He was ready to confront Joe again, not with demands or arrogance, but with a willingness to listen, to learn, and perhaps, if he was lucky, to be forgiven. Charles reached out to Joe, requesting a meeting. This time, there were no grand gestures, no attempts to impose his authority. Instead, he invited Joe to a quiet cafe outside the bustling office district, hoping the humble setting would convey the sincerity of his intentions. When Joe arrived, he looked at Charles with a calm but curious expression, his eyes still holding that same depth of understanding that had first unsettled Charles. They sat together at a small table, the clinking of cups and low murmur of other patrons around them creating a strangely comforting backdrop. Charles took a deep breath. "Joe, I owe you an apology," he began. His voice softened with a humility he hadn't known he was capable of. "I was wrong about so many things. About you, about what it means to lead, even about myself." Joe nodded, listening intently but saying nothing, allowing Charles the space to continue. "I thought respect was something I could demand. I thought my success came from being the smartest person in the room," Charles admitted, his gaze falling to his hands. "But you've shown me that real leadership isn't about power or intimidation. It's about trust, respect, and understanding people's worth. Something I failed to see in you, in others, and even in myself." Joe's face softened, his expression shifting to one of quiet encouragement. "It's good to see that you're willing to look inward, Charles. Real change can only begin when we recognize our own flaws." The weight of Joe's words settled on Charles, but instead of feeling crushed, he felt strangely uplifted. "I know I can't undo what's been done," he said. "But if you're willing, I would like to start fresh. I want to learn how to lead in a way that values everyone, not just those at the top." Joe studied him for a moment, and then slowly, a warm smile spread across his face. "Charles, everyone deserves a chance to grow. If you're sincere, I believe that even the hardest of hearts can change." Charles felt a sense of relief, a quiet hope stirring in him. Joe had offered him a chance, not only to rebuild his company but to redeem himself. And for the first time, Charles saw a future where his legacy might be one of respect, humility, and genuine leadership. In the weeks that followed, Charles committed himself to the promise he had made. He started showing up early, walking the halls and observing the daily operations, not from a place of superiority, but with a genuine desire to understand the people who made Whitmore Enterprises thrive. He spoke to employees he'd barely noticed before, learning their names, listening to their concerns, and even lending a hand when it was needed. To the surprise of his staff, Charles initiated changes that reflected his newfound humility. He implemented an open-door policy, encouraging employees to bring ideas, feedback, or even grievances directly to him. Where once he would have dismissed their input, now he welcomed it, understanding that the success of his company was built not on his power alone, but on the collective effort of every person within its walls. He also took it upon himself to reconnect with his executive team, holding meetings that focused less on quarterly profits and more on team morale, company culture, and respect for every role. Under Joe's subtle guidance, Charles was learning to lead with a new kind of strength, one that came from empathy and collaboration rather than authority and intimidation. Word of his transformation spread quickly, and soon even the most skeptical employees began to believe in the change they saw. Charles's sincere efforts inspired a renewed loyalty in his staff, and those who had once worked in fear of his temper now found themselves motivated by his newfound respect for their contributions. The atmosphere at Whitmore Enterprises began to shift, becoming a place where people felt valued and empowered. One afternoon, Charles found Joe back in the lobby, this time not as a janitor, but as a respected mentor and friend. He approached him with a smile, extending a hand that Joe shook warmly. "Thank you, Joe," Charles said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you." Joe smiled, the familiar twinkle of wisdom in his eyes. "You had it within you all along, Charles. Sometimes, all we need is a reminder of what truly matters." And with that, Charles felt a peace he had never known before, a peace that came from knowing he was not only a better leader but, perhaps for the first time, a better man. With time, Whitmore Enterprises transformed into a company known not only for its success but also for its integrity. Charles's personal growth had sparked a shift in the entire corporate culture, influencing everything from the way managers treated their teams to the way deals were negotiated. The company became a place where ambition and empathy coexisted, where profit and purpose found balance, and where every employee felt valued, from the boardroom to the maintenance staff. As for Joe, he continued to visit Whitmore Enterprises, though now his role was more advisory. Charles insisted that Joe hold a seat on the board, but Joe humbly declined, preferring to remain a quiet influence rather than a formal authority. His wisdom became a guiding light for Charles, a steady reminder of the values that should guide any true leader. One day, at an all-company gathering, Charles addressed his entire staff, his words reflecting the depth of his journey and the lessons Joe had taught him. He shared the story of his transformation, not hiding his past mistakes but embracing them as the catalyst for change. "I once believed that wealth and power alone defined success," he told his employees, "but I've learned that true success is defined by the respect we give and the respect we earn. I owe that lesson to a man who showed me that strength and humility are not opposites, but allies." The applause that followed was not just a formality, it was genuine, a testament to the respect and admiration Charles had earned through his honesty and growth. And as Charles looked out over the sea of faces, he noticed Joe standing quietly at the back, a proud, satisfied smile on his face. For the first time, Charles felt the weight of his position not as a burden, but as a privilege. Later, Charles approached Joe, extending his hand once more. "Thank you for everything," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I won't forget the lessons you've taught me." Joe clasped Charles's hand, his gaze filled with quiet pride. "Remember, Charles," he said, "power lies not in ruling over others but in lifting them up." From that day forward, Charles led not from a place of fear or authority, but from a place of respect and compassion. His empire flourished, and he became known not just as a successful businessman, but as a leader who cared. And in this final shift of power, both Charles and Joe found the legacy they'd always dreamed of. A legacy built not on wealth, but on wisdom, dignity, and true respect.